Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. Well, the conference season is in full swing. This week it is the Conservatives. The leader Kemi Badenoch yesterday saying that they are going to get tough on immigration. Where have we heard that before? That's right, from the Conservatives when they were in government and they didn't manage to do it. So will they offer this week on immigration? Will that be any well received by the voters in the coming months? Is there anything that Kemi Badenoch can do to seal any kind of deal with the country, or are they doomed? Russell Findlay, the Scottish leader, he's been railing against the woke agenda. But again, north of the border, is anyone listening? Do the Tories just have to take their medicine and accept that they're not going to be players for the remainder of this Parliament and at the next election? So we'll chew over some of the issues at the Conservative conference. And, you know, a year ago, an SNP conference for an SNP leader might have been something that was quite depressing, given the way the SNP performed at the last UK general election. But there's a spring in the step of nationalist activists as they gather for their conference. Why? Well, because the polls are really all rather good. But will it be a trouble-free conference for John Swinney with a key debate due on independent strategy? We'll chew over all of that as well. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Bernard.
Are they all doomed? That's the question for the Tories.
Well, in the long run, the answer to that is obviously yes. In the shorter to medium term, I think the answer is also probably yes, because as we've talked about on the show before, the problem when you've been in power for a long, long period of time, 14 years in this instance, 2000, since David Cameron came into Downing Street in 2010, when you've been in power for a long, long time and then the electorate turns against you decisively and gives you an almighty drubbing at a general election, whether it's Keir Starmer last year or obviously Tony Blair in 1997, you then have the issue of what do you do next? You've been sent a message by the electorate. You've been told to go home and think again. And that period of reflection is best done in private, frankly, because ultimately voters aren't interested in hearing very much from the new leader of the party that finds itself in those circumstances, whether it's Kemi Badenoch now or going back William Hague after the 1997 election. And, you know, if you ask William Hague now, he'd say, yeah, it was a mistake to go for the leadership then. I was too young, too inexperienced. It was the wrong time. He might have been a much more effective leader had he waited and let some other poor sap take that hospital pass. And Kemi Badenoch's in a similar position, I think. And so to that extent, all the sort of structures are against her. It doesn't really matter what she says because nobody is listening. But because nobody is listening, that then creates an incentive to go for ever more dramatic, headline-grabbing initiatives. But they aren't real. They're not credible because nobody really thinks the Conservative Party is going to form a government after the next general election. So people see these as being stunts and gimmicks more than they are a sort of credible policy platform. And that is, it's easy to say that Kemi Badenoch isn't the answer. But I would suggest, Bernard, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, that if the Tory party had picked James Cleverly or Robert Jenrick to be leader last year, I think the Conservative Party would be broadly in exactly the same position it is now. The problem isn't the leadership. The problem is timing and parliamentary arithmetic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I don't think it would matter who would lead them at this particular moment in time. I mean, in terms of what are they really trying to communicate at this conference, I think they're trying to communicate a number of things. One is that there'll be a certain amount of contrition that they didn't deal with the net migration figures. David Cameron said that they wanted to get them down to the tens of thousands. They didn't. And what they want to convey is that they're going to finally get real in this issue, that they accept that they were in part to blame, to look at a sort of period of contrition and try to make what they think is a credible offer, and which I don't think will be. In a sense, there's a crossing of the Rubicon of sorts here, because certainly when they were in government, there were interminable debates about whether or not the Conservatives were going to take a position where they would draw from the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, we now know that they have settled on that position. But of course, have they settled in that position because they have looked at the rules and regulations, they've looked at the international obligations, and they've come to the conclusion that it is not possible to cut the numbers whilst you're in the ECHR? Or have they done it for headline-grabbing reasons, i.e., for reasons of desperation? So there's an issue there on the whole immigration agenda, which I think they will want to pilot this week. The second thing, it'd be interesting to see what the Shadow Chancellor, Sir Mel Stride, says in his speech. I think, again, the message which is going to come out is that the public finances are out of order. You need aggressive cuts in public expenditure, particularly in relation to the welfare bill. They simply have to bite the bullet and say that in relation to things like personal independence payments, that people whose mental health is affected or a diagnosis of ADHD is not going to qualify you for payments in the future, that they're going to get tough on the spiralling welfare bill. But again, you get back to the problem is why is there indebtedness in the country? Well, the Conservatives were in power, for 14 years, 15 years, and the welfare bill continued to get out of control on their watch. So to a certain extent, all of the things which they're saying this week are an attack on the record of previous Conservative governments, or at least an admission that they didn't get things right. So the key question is, are the electorate in a forgiving mood on this? And my view is that they are not. And one final thought on this, and I'd like to get your view on this. I mean, we've touched on this many times in the podcast, which is the extent to which the mainstream party of the centre left and the mainstream party of the centre right are now, in terms of their strategy and in some respects in the content of their policy, are being completely and utterly driven by Reform UK and by Nigel Farage. So we have a situation where the Conservatives are going to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights because they think that it's not consistent with cutting the numbers. We now have a Labour position which is still gestating, but in terms of its direction of travel, is Reform UK LITE in terms of what it's doing on legal migration, with increasing indefinite leave to remain from 5 years to 10 years, upping the amount of money that people have to earn before they get there by looking at the numbers very, very rigidly. So we have a situation here where both Labour and the Conservatives are designing policies to deal with the threat of Reform UK. And it just sort of strikes me that what most people in the electorate who regard this as the number one issue in politics, and it's not all voters that think that, by the way, it's not all voters that think that this is the number one issue in politics, but for those who do believe that it's the number one issue in politics, whom the Conservatives and the Labour Party are trying to assuage at the moment, they will simply say to themselves, do you know what? What Starmer is doing and what Badenoch is doing in all of this is simply out of self-interest and desperation. We don't actually think they believe it. So what we're going to do is that we're going to vote for the one individual and the one party that does believe in all of this stuff. So the very thing that the Conservatives are trying to prevent this week, which is a further hemorrhaging to votes to Reform UK, will not work. Because if Starmer is dancing to Farage's tune, then she is singing along, and it won't work.
Well, yes, this is the question. Can you out-reform reform? And when you put it like that, the answer seems quite obviously to be no, that you can't. At the same time, I think there is a recognition from both the Labour and the Conservative parties that you have to be seen or perceived to be taking some of these issues seriously. But my sense or my suspicion, for what it's worth, Bernard, is that the anger that is apparent on immigration isn't really about immigration, or at least part of it is for some people. But overall, this is more of a symptom than a cause of a general public dissatisfaction with the established political parties of both right and left. And so the way you solve or address this isn't so much with tougher measures on immigration, however necessary they may be deemed in the short term. In the longer term, the way you deal with the threat of an insurgency from right or indeed from left is by establishing your credentials in other policy areas, particularly the economy. If the economy is growing, if people have more confidence in the economy, if they feel that their own standards of living are improving, then the appeal of extremist or populist parties of both right and left is diminished. Because while we talk awful lot about reform, I think we should also bear in mind the way in which the Green Party and Jeremy Corbyn's whatever it's called this week party is nibbling away at Labour in some of its metropolitan strongholds. There is a threat to Labour from the left as well as from the right, and that is something I think that we don't always pay quite enough attention to, and it's again symptomatic of a general public dissatisfaction, a sense that they're all useless, and none of them have the answers. And so, in that sense, why don't we embrace the certainty and the clarity, if you like, of the answers offered by Reform or the Green Party or whoever? The fact that there's a good reason why many of these policies are not actually mainstream, is neither here nor there in those circumstances. Because the Conservative Party is obviously having something of an identity crisis right now. It's not just the ECHR stuff. There's the suggestion of repealing the Climate Change Act, and that is going to cause bitter divisions within the party. I mean, so you have people like, say, Theresa May, Dominic Grieve, Ruth Davidson, who are all very much opposed to this general direction of travel, and who think, well, again, these are headline-grabbing initiatives, but the problem in the electricity market, for instance, which is a real one, because we have the highest industrial prices for power of any developed country outside Germany, apart from Germany, and that is a real problem, a real cost to British business, to the economy, and so on, as well as obviously to individual households. But is repealing the Climate Change Act actually the way that you address that, or are there actually more structural reforms that are needed? And it seems to me likely, on the balance of probabilities, that it's a little bit more complicated than just repealing the Climate Change Act. And so again, you have this headline-grabbing initiative, which doesn't really address the underlying issue, is also, as you correctly identify, an admission that, well, yeah, we got it wrong when we were in government, so please forgive us our sins, we've learned from them and we'll do better next time, and is in the end unserious. And that is the problem for the Conservative Party right now, is that it doesn't look a particularly serious party of the traditional centre-right. And even if you allow that traditional parties are in a lot of trouble all across Europe, or in many European countries anyway, it is clear that the Conservative Party is in a state of sort of crisis. I mean, if you speak to Tory grandees from the shires of England and so on, and they say, well, at our local association and so on, we have a meeting and 6 people turn up. And that's in seats that been Conservative for 180 years. There's a real issue there.
I mean, I think there's a longer term issue with the Tories, which is, what are they for, and what is the coherent? And I think we should stress the word, what is the coherent policy offering which the centre-right has? If we go all the way back, I mean, the 1980s, the period of Mrs. Thatcher, was a period when, you had the liberalisation of markets, the cutting of trade unions down to size, privatisation programmes, a sense in which the post-war consensus, which she railed against, had to be bust because the country was perennially in the grip of industrial chaos and all the rest of it. There was a sense in which Thatcherism, whether you agreed with it or didn't, offered a certain analysis of what was wrong and gave you a prescription, which a lot of people did not like. But it was, in a sense, politically coherent because it was rooted in certain principles. The premiership came to John Major really by chance. He sort of bumbled along, won an election, but nevertheless bumbled along. And then came
John Major's a much underrated prime minister.
Yes, but I mean, there was there wasn't that sort of sense of coherence because, in a sense, Thatcher had done everything and they'd run out of steam. And then he went through, the new Labour years where they had the opportunity to recharge the philosophical batteries, and you had Cameron and Osborne, who really parked themselves on a strategy which you could call New Labour light. I mean, people on the right regard the Cameron on Osborne years as a disaster because they simply said they gave in or accepted the New Labour analysis of the way in which you govern the country. So the sense in which there has been unease and a debate out with Europe, which has always been the sort of defining issue and to a certain extent the fault line of division. But behind the sort of European issue, the much more serious debate about where they stand philosophically has one that's been going on in the Conservative Party for many years. And they haven't resolved that issue. And because they haven't resolved it, when you get periods of opposition, what you get is policy by knee-jerk. That is what's happening at the moment. You get strategy by knee-jerk. You get completely and utterly desperate about the fact that you're not in the political game. You say things to get noticed. You say things to create a splash. And what you don't have is something which is coherent. And the problem is that, if you like, and Farage, again, whatever you think of him, if you get off the immigration agenda and onto economic policy, benefits, the size of the state, whether you think it is workable or not, comes from a strand on the political right, which you can say, yeah, I know where he's coming from. I look at Conservatives and think, I'm not sure where they come from. And I think the bigger and greater malaise is around the whole issue of it's not just an immigration where they don't know where they're going, they don't know where they're going in general terms.
And if that's true of the UK party, after last year's electoral drubbing, it seems to be quite obviously true of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party too. And you're looking ahead to next May's election, you know, the Conservative revival in Scotland was built on the constitutional issue. So from 2014 to in subsequent elections, that if a vote for the Conservatives was a vote for the Union, a vote against independence and the threat of independence offered by the SNP, then the Conservatives had a song to sing in Scotland, and one that they actually knew the words to and believed in as well wholeheartedly. And they could attract support from people who weren't necessarily natural Tories or traditional Tories, but who recognised that the more important thing was defeating the nationalist candidate in your constituency and offering some opposition, a coherent opposition to the SNP on the independence question. And of course, they were assisted in this post-2014 by the fact that for a number of years, the Labour Party was hopelessly divided on this question and would prefer to say nothing on the biggest issue facing Scottish politics, because Labour understood that they needed the support of people who voted no in 2014 and of people who voted yes in 2014. So under Kezia Dugdale and some of her successors, the Labour Party, basically retreated from constitutional politics, tried to change the subject when that was the only subject in town, the biggest and largest and clearest and most significant dividing line in Scottish politics. And so that gave the Conservatives an opportunity, which under Ruth Davidson in particular, they obviously took. But everybody agrees, we'll talk about the SNP conference in a moment, that next May's election is not about independence. Not even John Swinney really believes it's about independence. He may try and persuade the SNP's core vote and activists and so on that it is, and that independence is just around the corner. But everybody else knows that it isn't happening just now. And in the absence of independence, what do the Scottish Conservatives have to talk about? Yes, they can criticise the SNP's record on education, on health, on transport, on wokery, gone mad, as Russell Findlay is going to do. But does that amount to a coherent critique of the SNP's record in government? And what sort of alternatives would the Conservatives offer if they were given the opportunity? There's a straightforward question for you to answer, Bernard.
Yeah. Just as I said that there was a sort of malaise in terms of a wider debate about what the Conservatives are for in a UK sense, what are our underlying principles and how do those principles affect how we look at matters like migration and climate change and economic growth and all this kind of stuff? You can also say that there has been a similar malaise, in some respects an even more aggressive malaise, within the Scottish Conservatives, because you're right to point out that the period when they did reasonably well, which was to get a bounce, 2014, they got a bounce because, in a sense, unionists, hardcore unionists within the electorate were unhappy that Labour were not sufficiently robust enough in the Constitution, and that they ended up placing their cross in the Conservative box, not out of any real enthusiasm for the Conservatives, not out of any real understanding that the Scottish Conservatives had a coherent policy prospectus. They did it out of a frustration with the constitutional debate at that time. So the Conservatives had a revival post-2014 in spite of themselves, in spite of the fact that I think they had very little to say. And the reason why I say that the malaise in a Scottish context in some respects is even more concerning for them is that for the entire devolved period, this party of the centre-right has only ever faced parties of the centre-left in government. And yet in that entire time, it has manifestly failed to give an alternative vision of devolution. Now, from a centre-right perspective, they should have been asking themselves, how do we cut back the size and the shape of the Scottish state to make it more efficient? How do we properly empower business to get regulation off their back and to help with the issue of economic growth? Which taxes should we be cutting in order to foster an enterprise culture and to ensure that people keep more of the money in which they earn? How do we ensure that the justice system works for victims? How do we reel back on what was an emerging issue on what is now known as wokery? But there's been none of that. And in fact, if we look at all of the Conservative leaders in the devolved era, probably the only one who would have been an instinctive Thatcherite to his core was David McCletchie. And even McCletchie on occasions became dreary and managerialist in how he attacked the Scottish government of the day. And just as the Conservatives nationally, in a sense, really have to work out what it is they are for, the reason why we should be ultra critical of the Scottish Conservatives is that they've had a quarter of a century to work this out in a political system where they've always been the opposition. And again, it simply appears to me that and there were even issues where they were attacking executives from the left over things like free personal care. And so there has been an inability for year after year after year for the Tories to hammer away at what you could argue is wastefulness in expenditure in the wrong area, looking to actually cut tax rather than go along with a sort of high tax consensus. They say that they'll probably do this before the elections next year. I will hold my breath on that one.
No, don't do that. But don't hold your breath and so on, because you'll die if you do that before you get any answers.
They've not really worked out anything in terms of a clear strategy. And, here I feel a high degree of sympathy for Russell. There's nothing he can do. There's nothing he can do. That's the bottom line. When apparatchiks meet in rooms to plan strategy, they will have opinion polls to say, well, here are the attitudes in X, Y, and Z. And then you'll get people coming in saying, here are our target seats. And you'll get people saying, well, Russell, this is what you should be saying between now and next May. You don't need to have all these meetings, guys. It ain't happening. It ain't happening.
Yeah. I think Russell Findlay, he will present a manifesto rooted in what he will term common sense conservatism at the next election. And again, individually, some of the attitudes that the Tories will strike will be quite popular, but they will become less popular once people associate them with the Scottish Conservative Party. And that is a reputational, a brand taint, if you like, that is extremely difficult to escape from. But you look at the Scottish Parliament in the last week or so and so on, and you think, what has it been doing? There's a private members bill that now has the support of the Parliament to proceed from stage 1 to stage 2, which would criminalise dog theft. Well, it's already illegal to nick people's dogs. It's absolutely preposterous, pointless piece of legislation introduced by a Conservative MSP, Maurice Golden, that now has the support of all the parties in the wee Parliament. That sort of thing, I would suggest, that's not a Tory front bench initiative. It's not part of the Tory manifesto, but it is symptomatic of the way in which the Parliament operates. It seems to be that you have a Conservative member offering this in the same way as, you're right to identify that when John Swinney, for instance, says to Russell Findlay, well, you ask us to do this, this and this and so on, but you're also asking us to spend more money on this, and we've got to cut taxes according to you and so on. So how do the sums add up? They don't add up. It's profoundly unserious. And John Swinney is right about that. In some ways, but the fact that you have the Parliament then fannying around with dog theft legislation and so on is somehow.
Sorry, what was that expression there?
Fannying around with dog theft legislation. Yeah. I mean, and then then people start complaining about.
Maybe there's a slogan for them: free fanning around.
Then the cat people get involved and say, well, why doesn't this cover cats? Why do you hate cats? Big cat. Well, not big cat, because that's lions and tigers, isn't it? But the whole thing just becomes ridiculous. And so, as I say, that's not Russell Findlay's fault per se, but it is a problem for the Parliament more generally, I would suggest.
Yes. And let's move on to the SNP. I think we've had enough fanning around with the Tories.
We haven't even done seagulls either. The Seagull Summit.
Seagull Summits, yes. Let's move on. Well, I suppose, the SNP conference, it looks as if there's going to be a debate on independent strategy. Now, this could have been, I suppose, if the polls were different, a potentially very, very fractious debate, where some people are saying, we need a more robust agenda on this, and we need a more bullish strategy, and we want the First Minister to lead from the front. I suspect the mood now will be, even among people who don't necessarily like what the First Minister is saying, is that the polls are looking not too bad. Of course, those polls do demonstrate that from the last election, the SNP support is massively down. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact. But the next election is going to be a parliament of minorities. But if you're just a big enough minority on something like 35% of the vote, particularly in the first past the post section of the electoral system, you might do not too badly. And given that there were all sorts of apocalyptic feelings in the SNP 16 months ago, they're in not a bad position. And in some respects, an utterly astonishing position given how long they have been in power. I mean, if the opposition in Parliament were doing the job effectively and had managed to nail the SNP's record to the SNP mast, then the poll should be telling a different story. So I think I think the attitude at the conference will be, well, we're going to debate this, but be careful how we debate it. Let's not rock the boat too much, because everything looks not too bad. And at the moment, it does seem as if we're in pole position. And, if Mr. Swinney's saying it's 65 seats before this is back on the agenda, depending on how the arithmetic falls, although I don't think they're going to get to 65, they might be there or thereabouts. But it's truly astonishing how much things have changed within a year. But it's also the case that I think that things can change back the way. And I think for Labour in particular, Anas Sarwar has to partly rely on no more, to borrow a Masseyism, no more fanning about in London with self-inflicted political own goals. And secondly, the election campaign next year will be all important from their point of view. So things are looking reasonably good for the SNP, but, they're not, by any manner of means, in my view, a shoo-in at the next election.
No, I mean, and there's a palpable lack of enthusiasm or excitement, I think, even amongst the SNP as they approach this conference. It's not a make or break conference for John Swinney; it's a steady as you go conference for John Swinney, and in that sense, it sort of fits his administration in many ways. This is a sort of holding period for the SNP until the other side of the next election, where, yes, as opinion polls suggest, they are likely to remain the largest party, albeit on 35% of the vote, which would be very, very low by recent standards for the SNP, would previously have been considered a disaster. But because the opposition to the SNP is now fractured in so many different ways, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Reform, Greens offering a little bit of an alternative from the left as well, albeit not as, not opposition in the same way as some of the other parties are, because the opposition is so fractured, the SNP could win 58, 60 seats on 35% of the vote if the voting patterns fall the right way for them, which would simultaneously be an extraordinary result and a repudiation of the SNP in government simultaneously. Because their share of the vote would obviously have fallen very significantly, and they would be the largest minority in a parliament of minorities. Then, however, it's because you've got to have a very different SNP parliamentary group, because so many SNP members are retiring or standing back, and they'll be replaced by new people, and there'll be that will give the SNP a bit of a lift. I think there will be opportunity to restart certain government portfolios with new people, because so many cabinet secretaries are retiring, Shona Robertson, people like that, and so that will be when Swinney would then presumably unveil what it is he actually wants to do. But at the moment, I don't think there is a clear message from the SNP really about what it wants to do. And the SNP's success should be understood, I think, as at a time when people are disenchanted with mainstream parties, and they've come to the conclusion that they are all useless to one degree or another. The SNP's success rests on the fact that, well, if they're all useless, then let's at least stick with the useless ones we know, rather than take the risk of fresh and unknown uselessness with people that we don't know so well. And so to that extent, the SNP's triumph is in some ways an indictment of the political scene in Scotland more generally.
I couldn't disagree with a word of that. And it is actually truly astonishing that, they've been in power since 2007. I mean, irrespective of whether you're an SNP supporter or not, when political parties are in power for that length of time, the feeling that it's time for a change, which grips a country every once in a while, is a very, very pertinent one. And the fact that even after 19 years in government, and it'll be 20 years by the time we get to the election, that they're still in pole position to form a government is actually truly astonishing. I mean, I suppose we should go back through the history books to see if there's any party in... I think in Catalonia, Pujol managed 19 years after their referendum and devolved government, but it's certainly a long time. And his tenure as First Minister, in all likelihood, on current polls, will continue. And on the issue of the office of First Minister, on the 11th of October, that would mark the 25th anniversary of the death of the First Minister, Donald Dewar. And in our next podcast, we're going to consider his life, career and legacy, and look at his record alongside the record of all of the other First Ministers, perhaps even give them some marks out of 10, Alex.
Oh, sort of fantasy first ministers, who are you going to draft first, Bernard? Oh, the excitement gathers, and I'm sure listeners will be agog to discover where you've ranked Henry McLeish, for instance. But that will be coming later in the week. As always, thank you very much to everyone who's listening and recommending the podcast to friends and family and so on. Thank you very much to everybody who's been watching on the YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to it as well. And as Bernard says, we will be back later in the week and look at Donald Dewar's life and legacy and how the office of First Minister has changed or expanded or whatever in the more than 25 years now of devolution. But for the time being, and until then, it is a cheery conference season goodbye from me.
And yes, that's enough fanning about from us today. It's a goodbye from me.